The Washington Journal continues. It is now just about 8 o'clock East Coast time, and in our next hour, a conversation with Glenn Greenwald of Salon.com. And also later in the program, David Brooks, who has a piece this morning in the New York Times called Greed and Stupidity. We'll be digging into some of the details with that. But Glenn Greenwald, thanks very much for joining us.
My pleasure to be here.
Let me begin by something both you and David Brooks write about, and they're the words of another columnist, Simon Johnson. He has a piece in Atlantic Monthly called The Quiet Coup. What is the essence of what he's writing about?
Well, I think it's actually quite frightening, and if I had one article that I could recommend this month that every American would read, it would be Simon Johnson's, because he was previously the chief economist with the International Monetary Fund and has dealt with very severe financial crises in all sorts of countries, similar to the one with which the United States and the rest of the world is currently dealing. And what he says is that the way in which the crisis has unfolded in the United States, and I think more importantly, the way in which we're attempting to address that crisis, is very similar to the way in which other emerging market nations who have experienced grave financial collapse, and he lists Argentina and Russia as the prime examples, attempted to deal with their financial crisis. And in particular, what he says is that what those societies were characterized by, more than anything else, was domination by a very narrow financial elite, essentially the oligarchical class within the country, which was able to influence and control the government to enact policies that were designed to benefit only that narrow class. And because they were so unrestrained in what they were able to do, because their control over their government was so virtually unlimited, they were able to run amok and create essentially financial catastrophe. And then once that catastrophe was created, what the government would then seek to do, because it was so influenced by the wealthiest individuals, is, as a response to the crisis, try and enact even further policies that was designed to prop up and benefit the very oligarchs who caused the crisis in the first place. And what Simon Johnson says is that what's happening in the United States is exactly that our Congress and our government are so controlled, essentially so owned by the financial elites who caused the crisis, that what we're doing is continuing to prop them up at the expense of ordinary Americans.
One point we should mention is that Simon Johnson is going to be with us on Monday for a full hour to take your phone calls from 8 to 9 Eastern Time. But in his piece, he says that essentially the finance industry has effectively captured our government.
Well, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about that. A colleague of his who was previously an economist at the IMF as well, the same day that Simon Johnson's article came out, had an op-ed in the Washington Post in which he essentially said that Goldman Sachs, the New York investment bank, seems to have a virtual lock on Treasury Department positions. Under the Clinton administration, the Treasury Secretary was the former Goldman CEO, Robert Rubin. Of course, under President Bush, the CEO who designed the bailout packages was former Goldman Sachs CEO Hank Paulson. The current Treasury Secretary, Tim Geithner, is a protege of Robert Rubin. His chief of staff is a former lobbyist with Goldman Sachs, and that's just one firm. But you look across the government, and what you see is the financial industry, through its enormous financial resources, pouring money into the campaign coffers of the members of Congress, controlling members of the executive branch. And so each and every policy that the executive branch under both Bush and Obama have promulgated and advocated as a response to the crisis has as the prime beneficiaries the financial elites who fund them and who control them, and to whom they are inextricably linked. And it's a form of extreme corruption in general. And I think in a case where there's a real crisis, it's a particular problem. The other thing I would underscore is that if you go back and look at how the crisis began, in the 1990s, the financial industry was advocating rigorously that many of the limitations that existed on what they were able to do, that were in place since the Great Depression to prevent another depression, were abolished one by one on a bipartisan basis, because they fund both political parties and they were able to write the laws, and those regulations were abolished at their behest. That's what caused the financial crisis, and that same corrupt system is still fueling what is intended to be the solution.
From the G20 to legalizing drugs to Gitmo, you're writing about it all, and we will get into some of the specifics. Do you also Twitter?
Actually, I've started to Twitter, and I think just to experiment with whether it has real value. I haven't actually seen the value in it yet, but I'm still searching with an open mind. I think actually there is a danger that if our communications become too truncated, and Twitter has a 140-character limit on each entry, the amount of our discourse, the level of our discourse can degrade even further still. I mean, we already have political discourse dominated by very short 10-minute or 5-minute segments in between commercial breaks, assuming the public has a very small attention span. I think Twitter is a step in the wrong direction, and so I do think it has a potential to degrade our discourse even further.
Well, we're going to try it this morning. We'll see how many tweets we get. But if you want to log on to twitter.com/washjournal, and you can, if you have an account, we'll include some of your comments as part of our discussion with Glenn Greenwald. You wrote about a question that Chuck Todd, NBC News White House correspondent, asked President Obama at last week's news conference on the issue of sacrifices when it comes to the economy. What were you referring to?
Well, I found Chuck Todd's question unbelievably revealing about how our media stars think. There was a question that arose when George Bush began commencing wars in the wake of 9/11, which was, well, if we're really at war, don't we need to sacrifice as Americans? In other words, how is it that we can go and send our military around the world to invade, destroy, and then attempt to rebuild Iraq and occupy Afghanistan and send billions of dollars to Israel and flood the Middle East with our influence? How can we do all of that, put this enormous pressure, economic pressure, and at the same time give ourselves huge tax cuts? How can we fund this imperialistic foreign policy and at the same time pay less taxes? Eventually the system will collapse, and don't Americans need to sacrifice if we're truly at war? That was the question posed to the Bush administration. So Chuck Todd stood up and asked that same question, though this time to President Obama in a completely different context, in the context of the economic crisis, which he equated to a war. And he said, don't Americans, why aren't you asking Americans to sacrifice? It was a bizarre question, because if you don't live as a millionaire media star in Washington, you know that across the country, the whole point of the financial crisis is that there's enormous sacrifices being made by ordinary Americans. They're losing their jobs, they're losing their homes, they're losing their retirement security, the ability to send their children to college. And so it was both an idiotic question and at the same time, I thought, a revealing one, because it was essentially assuming that Americans aren't suffering enough, and that the key to solving the financial crisis, the premise embedded in this question was, and Chuck Todd's question, was that it isn't the financial elites who need to sacrifice, but it's ordinary Americans. They need to give up Social Security benefits, Medicare, Medicaid, and that is really what the political class is now attempting to do. It's what Simon Johnson actually says was done in Russia and Argentina and these other emerging market nations, which is that the financial elites caused the crisis, and then the government turns to ordinary Americans to demand sacrifice, and I think that's what Chuck Todd was advocating.
Let me ask you to respond to what David Brooks writes this morning in the New York Times, Greed in Stupidity. He's going to be with us in the next hour. He says the U.S. economy got finance heavy and finance mad and finally collapsed, and when it did, the elites did what all elites do. They took care of their own.
No, I think actually that's entirely true. You know, again, if you look at the way in which our government functions, it is essentially a wholly owned subsidiary of our financial elites, and that isn't how it was supposed to be. Lobbyists come to Washington on behalf of the largest corporations, and they write the laws. And that doesn't change if there's Republicans controlling the Congress or the Democrats controlling the Congress. The two political parties are funded largely by the same corporate interests who control our system of government. Those are the corporate factions that engorge themselves greedily at the expense of America's financial health, and they're the ones who continue to drive how the response is formulated. And I think it's an extremely serious problem that goes beyond the financial crisis into the fundamental corruption of how the United States government has been functioning.
Two other points. First of all, on Guantanamo, a week ago you said one of the problems that this government is going to face, and I'm paraphrasing, is that when these detainees are released, they're free to talk about their treatment. Is that something that the U.S. government is worried about? Is that something that, based on what you wrote about, the British government was able to stop?
I don't think there's any question that the Bush administration was very worried about that, and the Obama administration, unfortunately, seems to be just as committed to keeping concealed what it is that we did to detainees. I mean, there's a debate in this country about whether or not what the Bush administration did constituted torture and war crimes. It clearly did. Whether or not we were right to do it. Well, if that's true, then we ought to welcome, both sides of that debate ought to welcome having American courts decide whether or not what the government did was actually illegal, and we ought to welcome a full and free airing of what it was that was truly done to these detainees. And yet the Obama administration has been taking steps to prevent courts from ruling on the legality of the Bush administration's counterterrorism policies. And during the Bush era, it was actually classified. The detainees were prevented from being heard from, and now that some of them are being released, they're describing the brutal torture to which they were subjected, that we've prosecuted other countries for doing as war criminals before. And the question will inevitably rise as these disclosures multiply, which is, how is it that the United States could have prosecuted and led the crusade against these very acts when done by other countries? But now that our own political leaders have authorized them and perpetrated them, why should they remain immune from consequences for having committed serious domestic crimes and the most serious war crimes?
And with all of these issues playing out, you also, your most recent blog at Salon.com, and there's a link, by the way, through cspan.org, on the issue of legalizing drugs, some drugs, and you quote Joe Klein, who out in Time magazine this week, why legalizing marijuana makes sense, and he paraphrases it in terms of the baby boomer generation, one of their last great crusades of those in their 50s and 60s. Is this something that is an agenda item? President Obama was asked about it at a town hall meeting and almost dismissed the question.
Well, I think it's clearly becoming a much more pressing question. And there's a willingness to debate openly our drug policy far more than was true in the past. And the reason is that the American criminal justice system is collapsing on its own weight. Senator Jim Webb from Virginia recently introduced, this week actually, a bill to study criminal justice and prison reform. And he pointed to a statistic that I think all Americans should know, which is that the United States has become the most aggressive nation of jailers in the entire world. We have less than 5% of the world's population, and yet 25% of prisoners worldwide are located in the United States. Huge numbers of them are there for nonviolent drug offenders. We impose the harshest criminal justice penalties of any country in the world. We imprison people for crimes that everywhere in the Western world, in the civilized world, our people are not put into prison for. And I actually am presenting a paper later today at the Cato Institute because in 2001, Portugal, a member of the European Union, had a similar problem that the United States had, an out-of-control drug problem. The more they criminalized, the worse the problem became. The more they put people in prison for drugs, the worse the problem became. And they convened a panel of experts to study the evidence, and what they concluded was the best possible policy approach to enable drug addiction to be addressed by the government meaningfully was to decriminalize all drugs, not to legalize them, but to decriminalize them, so that if someone takes drugs, they're not turned by the state into criminals. And what that enabled was citizens to seek treatment from the government without fear of being put into prison for being a drug addict. And it freed up enormous resources. I mean, we waste billions and billions of dollars on prosecuting and imprisoning and arresting people for nonviolent drug possession. And that money would be so much better put to, for example, funding treatment programs. And in Portugal, ever since decriminalization in 2001, their drug problem has been vastly improved, and their policy, the consequences of that policy are far superior to virtually every other Western nation, especially the ones with harsh criminalization schemes such as the United States and Great Britain.
We're talking with Glenn Greenwald. He's with Salon.com and his regular column, Unclaimed Territory, a graduate of George Washington University and NYU Law School. How did you go from being a lawyer to a blogger?
Well, it's interesting. I was actually reading blogs throughout 2003 and 2004 and found that the level of political discussion there was higher, certainly than what was taking place within our establishment media venues. And essentially I began the blog not in with any plan to become a journalist or a writer, but simply to participate as a citizen in that conversation about what I thought and still think is the radicalism that had been consuming the country. And the advent of the internet is such that citizens can simply start writing and find a large audience fairly quickly without having to rely upon or go through the large corporations that own our media outlets. And it's really diversified the types and views that are now routinely heard.
We are tracking the tweets on Twitter. Say that 5 times real fast. If you have any comments, you can Twitter us, and we'll get to your emails as well. But we'll go back to the conventional format as well with phone calls. Durham, New York, with Glenn Greenwald. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Greenwald. I'm very concerned about the corporate capture of the media, and I'm sure we're on the same page on that. But I'd like you to talk about that if possible. I'm also interested in the fact that the next guest will be Mr. Brooks, who all of a sudden has seen the light. I suspect that 5 years ago he was actually seeing this light, but it wasn't in his interest to bring the subject up, and I'll leave it at that.
Well, I think the caller raises a very important point about who it is that owns our major media outlets. I mean, if you look at where most Americans get their news, increasingly it's through diversified sources online and blogs and alternative media, but still overwhelmingly they get them from a handful of large media outlets. And those large media outlets are almost entirely owned by huge corporations that have very specific self-interest in terms of their relationship to the government, in terms of the policies that benefit the financial class, as we were discussing earlier. And so it only stands to reason that if you have a very homogenized set of corporations that control and own media outlets, that the range of viewpoints that Americans will hear from those media outlets is extremely narrow. And you can look issue after issue, from single-payer health care to our blind support for Israel to the idea that our political leaders shouldn't be investigated and prosecuted when they break the law. And what you find is that views that are shared by enormous numbers of Americans, often majorities, are simply excluded, by and large, from our media discussions in these establishment outlets. And the reason is that these are corporate environments with corporate owners, and they have very specific self-interest, and there is not free discussion that takes place within those venues. As far as David Brooks is concerned, I think he's symbolic, though I think that's true of lots of people, is while these policies are being implemented and before it's evident that they are so destructive, we have lots of political pundits and political commentators who support them, who cheer them on. That was, of course, true with the Iraq War and most of the extremism of the Bush administration. And it's only once it becomes so apparent that these policies are so corrosive and destructive do they suddenly stand up and essentially pretend that they were opponents of it all along, and there's very little accountability in the journalism class because of that.
Waldorf, Maryland, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, C-SPAN, for having on such an intelligent guest. It's about time. You got somebody there to tell the truth and talk straight. My question is, number one, where can I get more information to gain a better understanding of who and how these corporations have gained such control? And my second question is, what do you think it's going to take for America to wake up? I mean, in my mind, we're on the brink of another civil war. In my mind, and I don't see how that's unavoidable if things stay the way that they are. I don't understand why it's taking people so long to wake up and realize what's going on. And one last thing, if you could, I've been hearing a lot about this Bilderberg meeting or whatever it is. Can you elaborate on who these people are and what they do and where they're from?
Sure. I mean, essentially those questions are all excellent and actually are quite interrelated. I mean, one of the ways in which our government functions now is that there's very little transparency. I mean, the Bush administration was obsessed with secrecy to the point of classifying even the most mundane details. But even before that, our federal government has been constructing rather steadily a wall of secrecy behind which they can function without any transparency, without the citizenry knowing what they're doing. And most of what takes place in terms of how our laws are written, who's influencing those laws, takes place behind closed doors. I mean, the Federal Reserve has added trillions of dollars to its balance sheet and yet refuses to disclose to whom they've even lent the money. We've transferred hundreds of billions of dollars to corporations as part of our TARP bailout fund, and they simply refuse to account for how that money was spent. And so when you ask, well, how is it that we can learn about who it is who's exerting this influence? I mean, part of the problem is that the government, which is supposed to be transparent and open at its very core, has become almost entirely opaque. And I think in terms of what citizens can do, there's clearly increasing levels of dissatisfaction and even anger among the citizenry, not breaking down between conservatives and liberals, Democrats and Republicans, but simply citizens and people who are connected to and inside of the government. And you hear more and more members of the political class and the media elites urging that this populist anger be tapped down and turned off and diffused because I think they're becoming increasingly afraid that their corrupt ways has some limit. And that limit is what the citizenry will tolerate. And unfortunately, it seems that the political class doesn't listen to the concerns of citizens unless they're afraid of the citizenry. And that's why I think that the level of citizenry anger is actually quite overdue and something that ought to be encouraged and I hope continues to increase, because it's the thing that I think is uniquely effective in checking the kind of corruption that we've been discussing.
We've been spending a lot of time talking about the substance of the G20 summit in London. President Obama is now in France. He just wrapped up a news conference with French President Sarkozy, and these are live pictures also from Strasbourg, France, where President Obama is going to begin a town hall meeting, a familiar staple during the presidential campaign. And as you look at this scene in France, Glenn Greenwald, impression?
Well, I think that the promise of the Obama presidency is that it was something that could and still might revitalize the symbol of America as something positive. Our face over the last 8 years, and before that, but certainly the last 8 years intensified it, were things like people in orange jumpsuits chained and kneeling on the ground, being disappeared into CIA black sites, being tortured and kidnapped and disappeared, invading other countries, and there's a perception as well that it's our greed and our lack of effective government that catalyzed the financial crisis. So there's clearly a desire on the part of much of Western Europe, certainly, and I think Latin America as well, for America to once again start to become a force, at least for better, if not for good. And Obama's charisma and the historic nature of his presidency and his eloquence clearly has the capability to change the way that the United States is perceived and to spawn actual leadership in the world. Whether that actually happens, whether there will be meaningful change, I think still remains to be seen.
Santa Barbara, California is next. Good morning on the Democrats line.
Good morning. Mr. Greenwald, I spoke with you briefly about 2 years ago at the blogger convention in Chicago, and I spoke to you about a particular issue, and there's been some recent developments, and so I just wanted to update you on that because it actually connects directly to Congress and Congress's policy failures in regards to drugs, media, banking, just special interests that control Congress, and that is the Convention Clause of Article 5 of the Constitution. The national group Friends of the Article 5 Convention have put together a database for the first time in American history that showed there are over 700 applications on the Senate and House congressional records requesting a convention. And recently there was a report out of Missouri about the militia movement in America. And that report says, and also Ohio, the state legislature in Ohio is under the impression also that we are 32 state applications towards a national convention. And so I guess, I just want to ask you, if you can, sometime in the near future, maybe discuss, us holding a national convention and simply on the grounds of the rule of law, which is that once those applications go on record, Congress has to issue the call.
It's interesting. I practiced constitutional law for many years before becoming a political writer, and so I have always been in the past rather resistant to the idea that the Constitution needs some sort of radical re-examination. I think the founders, with some exceptions, got the Constitution basically right, and the safeguards in it are extremely important. And the problem is not that we don't have the right Constitution in place. The problem is that our Constitution is routinely trampled upon and violated, and we don't do anything about that. Having said that, I do think that there are some radical and fundamental problems within our political system that very well might warrant a reconsideration of at least some of the structures within the Constitution to determine whether or not the Constitution, which at its core was designed to place limits on the power of the political class, needs to be supplemented and strengthened in order to limit what is the out-of-control corruption that permeates our elites.
The Twitters are coming in.
Excellent.
Twitter at Wash Journal. So if you want to do so, we welcome your participation. One comment, Mr. Greenwald, what is the solution to his position that Simon Johnson is correct and that financial elites have control of government?
Well, I think that, James Madison talked about the fact that what is necessary is that the government fears the citizenry and not the other way around, that the citizenry fears the government. And as I said, the reason why there's pillaging taking place on the part of financial elites is because they think that there are no consequences for them to do that. And thus far, that's been true. I think Americans are now starting to wake up and realizing that everything that they hold as important, namely their financial security, their ability to own a home, their ability to send their children to college, to have just a mildly respectable standard of life, is being now threatened by this cooperative corruption on the part of Wall Street and Washington. And there's anger, and the anger is growing, and it will continue to grow until that corruption is checked. I wish I could say that the safeguards that the founders put into place to serve as checks on what our political elites could do would be working. But we've seen in the past 8 years that Congress and the media are uniquely inept at this point, or even unwilling to impose those checks. They participate in much of what takes place, and so I think the ultimate check will be the citizens standing up and refusing to tolerate it any longer.
Another tweet, you came up with that term, but anyhow, Glenn, talent is limited and the best are being pulled from the same colleges. What would you have us do?
I'm not sure I understand entirely the...
I think part of the essence is that it's a small group of schools, whether it's Harvard, Princeton, Yale, that we're pulling from these schools.
Well, I think that...
you look at the president's cabinet,
right?
It's mostly Ivy League.
Yeah, that's true. Although the last administration, although the president was a graduate of Yale, sort of specialized in filling positions high up in the Justice Department and elsewhere with graduates of Liberty College and Pat Robertson's Regent schools in order to ensure ideological adherence to the president's agenda. And there are members of the establishment who don't grow up as being that. But I think that the culture of Washington and of Wall Street is so consuming and so intense that no matter where you come from, once you arrive, there is a corrupting influence that is very potent. And unless you're willfully resisting it, I think it ends up transforming even well-intentioned people who end up being essentially annexed by that culture. And so I don't think the problem is so much where do the people come from who fill these positions. I think the problem is what is it that they do once they fill them.
Our next call from Houston, good morning, with Glenn Greenwald. And tell the dog to go outside. Go ahead, caller. You with us?
Hello?
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for speaking out about corruption. I think we have a legalized bribe system in America with the lobbyists, and we should not allow any group money to be contributed to campaigns. Individual contributions only from from registered voters with total transparency. This group money it's destroying our nation.
Caller, one of the tweets that we got, and this is directed to Mr. Greenwald, saying that we should begin boycotting major campaign contributors, he says, to the Republican Party and demand legislation of them.
We had a case go before the Supreme Court where corporations were not allowed to give campaign contributions. They came up with the lobby system, which is basically the same thing. I think what we need is the Supreme Court of the United States to disallow any groups to organize, pull their money together, and give their money as campaign contributions. They can organize and give their ideas. They can have free speech. But this money thing is a legalized bribe system. They're just buying votes. And then we sit home and wonder why everything's in such a mess.
She's exactly right. It is legalized bribery that is the fuel that drives the city in which we're sitting, which is Washington. I'll just give you one quick example. Last year, numerous Americans brought suit against their telecommunications companies, AT&T, Verizon, and the like, because those companies broke the law by turning over to the Bush administration access to the telephone calls of their customers without having to first obtain warrants as the law required. They broke the law in numerous ways. And they were sued by their customers for breaking the law and violating their rights. And those telecommunications companies hired the most expensive lobbyists in Washington, former Bush and Clinton administration officials, who called their friends in Congress and got paid huge amounts of money to do it, and continuously pressured and cajoled members of Congress of both parties to write a law that had no purpose other than to immunize those telecommunications companies from the lawsuits that had been brought against them. I mean, if ordinary Americans are sued for breaking the law or for violating rights, no member of Congress writes a law immunizing them. But because these telecommunications companies have scores and armies of lobbyists and pour huge amounts of money into the campaign coffers, they poured enormous amounts of money into the campaign coffer, for example, of Jay Rockefeller, who was a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and he then became the leading proponent, a Democrat, of writing a bill to immunize the same people who were pouring money into his campaign, and the Congress got together and passed a law to immunize the telecom companies that flood Washington with money. I mean, it's pure corruption in its most transparent form, and yet the caller is right, it's legalized. The problem is that the First Amendment does guarantee the right of petitioning the government and freedom of speech, and spending money to petition your government representatives is a right that even corporations have. So I think the solution is, as the caller suggested, for greater transparency in this process, and again, for citizens to remove from office, whether Democrat or Republican, members of Congress who get here and write laws that are designed to benefit their corporate donors, and laws that are actually written by lobbyists on behalf of those donors.
A couple of minor items from the morning papers I want to get your reaction to. First, from the New York Times, bidding Limbaugh farewell, citing the so-called millionaire's tax on the new state budget. Rush Limbaugh announcing this week that he's packing up and leaving town. He does most of his shows from South Florida, but he will no longer broadcast from WABC in New York City.
You know, I mean, I think Rush Limbaugh has proven himself to be, you know, about nothing other than generating attention for Rush Limbaugh, and the idea that he somehow put upon or burdened by a tax, given the extraordinarily profligate way that he lives, I think is as much of a joke as most of what comes out of his mouth, and I doubt there's anyone in New York who will lament his departure.
In fact, Governor David Paterson said, if I knew that that would be the result, I would have thought about the taxes earlier.
There you go. I think there are very few states that would do anything other than celebrate Rush Limbaugh's departure.
Ward Churchill, who was acquitted, a jury finding on Thursday that the University of Colorado wrongfully dismissed the professor who drew national attention for an essay in which he called some of the victims of September 11th little Eichmanns.
I think actually that's a very important case, because what happened there was that Ward Churchill expressed an opinion which was extremely controversial, especially at the time. And the essence of what he was saying is something that typically was not allowed to be heard, particularly back then. What he was arguing was that 9/11 was a tragedy. Of course, there are people who died in 9/11 who were innocent and who didn't deserve to die. But the idea that Americans were walking around bewildered about why 9/11 happened was something that he had a hard time understanding. And his point was that the United States, more than any country in the world, bombs, occupies, invades, interferes in other countries, specifically Muslim countries. And if you're a country that continuously has a government that bombs and occupies and invades countries in the Middle East, at some point, people in the Middle East are going to revolt against that military aggression and launch an attack. Now, you can agree or disagree, obviously, with that view, but the idea that the government should remove somebody from their job, especially a tenured professor, because they've expressed a unpopular viewpoint or even a wrong viewpoint, is something that ought to disturb everybody. The First Amendment is designed to prohibit exactly that, and that's what the jury found. And I think all Americans disagree or agree with Ward Churchill should celebrate that.
If you're the University of Colorado, do you bring him back on the payroll? Do you return him to the classroom?
Right. I think they're going to be ordered to. Ultimately, that's what the most likely outcome of this case will be, assuming that the jury verdict is sustained on appeal. If they wrongfully removed him, the remedy is to compel his reinstatement.
Bronson, Michigan, for Glenn Greenwald. Good morning.
Yeah, this is, I'm glad I'm talking to you. I've tried before. I do agree on the corporations giving too much money to our congressmen and senators, and I don't blame the corporations for trying. Who I blame for taking it is the congressmen and senators. But the congressmen and senators aren't any different than all the other people we have out in this country that are standing around waiting for a handout. They don't want to work. They want the government to give them some money. And we have gone round the clock with this kind of mentality in this country. We have people that think that everybody owes them something. They don't want to have to really stress themselves to get it themselves. And our congressmen and senators are getting to be the same way. They want handouts from the corporation. It's gotten to the point where everybody wants a handout.
Well, I find that mentality a bit bizarre, given that the essence of the financial crisis, the reason that it's caused so much pain, is because every single month 500,000 Americans who were working and want to work have lost their jobs because factories have closed or companies have laid them off. So the essence of the financial crisis is not people sitting around refusing to work, even though there are jobs that are unfilled. The essence of the financial crisis is that huge numbers of Americans, millions upon millions, who were working and working hard, don't have jobs anymore and have been laid off or fired. And so I think the problem is the exact opposite as the one the caller just described. They're not looking for free money, they're actually looking for work.
Grand Rapids, Michigan, good morning.
Hi. It seems to me like you really are trying to stress corruption, and I would just ask you to point out what happened with the Bush administration when they went after Spitzer, because he was going forward on predatory lenders, the bankers, and the attorneys general in the states. I believe all 50 of them had initiated actions, and Bush had the federal government step in and stop it. Now, this would effectively have protected consumers had the corruption that was identified been prosecuted and had others enforced from the Justice Department. But when you have no enforcement from the top down, when you have corruption on top, and you don't prosecute, and you don't impeach Bush, and you don't impeach Cheney, and all those corrupt characters underneath them, then we suffer. Have we learned anything yet? And I'm just hoping that President Obama does something, because we know, everybody knows, and if we just allow his wonderful manner to sort of hypnotize us to go forward without taking steps to create a better society underneath and actually punishing people so that they can see that is the result, then we're going nowhere.
And I think the Elliot Spitzer case is a very interesting and revealing case of how warped our priorities are. I mean, he really was targeting and identifying and warning us about the pervasive corruption on Wall Street, and including the very derivative products that ended up causing so much damage, and the people who have essentially robbed the American people of their financial security, and our government officials who committed war crimes and tortured people and lied us into a war, a devastating war, are people who are completely protected and face no consequences and essentially are immunized from the consequences of their actions. And yet Elliot Spitzer, for what essentially was a petty sex scandal, having consensual sex with other adults, was forced out of office in an extremely unusual way. He was pursuing criminals on Wall Street, the most powerful criminals on Wall Street, and suddenly the federal government launched a major investigation involving wiretaps and all sorts of surveillance, very expensive surveillance, that's virtually never done for minor crimes like prostitution, which are generally left to investigations by the state. And he was forced out of office, and that crusade against Wall Street corruption terminated. He was the enemy of the very Wall Street barons who caused the financial crisis. And yet it's incredible that for minor sex crimes we drive politicians from office. For major war crimes we don't.
Who do you think was behind that?
Well, the Bush Justice Department is clearly the entity, there's no question about that, the agency that commenced the investigation and oversaw the massive amount of resources that were spent in order to engage in surveillance on Governor Spitzer for committing what we always treat as a very minor crime, which is consensual prostitution. And I think the caller raises an important point, is what happens to the rule of law in this country when we allow our political leaders to commit major crimes and then we immunize them and allow financial elites to commit major pillaging and theft and fraud and refrain from prosecuting them, and yet punish the politicians who are trying to do something about it for very minor offenses. I think there's a lot there in this Spitzer case that ought to be looked into still as to why the Justice Department took those unusual steps to persecute him.
Last issue, Kit Seeley this morning, the New York Times, writing that some in Alaska want another election as a result of overturning, or likely to be overturning, the conviction of Senator Ted Stevens, who served from 1968 until this past January.
Yeah, that's ludicrous. We have elections, and frequently what happens is the citizenry believes certain things at the time of the election, and it turns out later on that it isn't true. I mean, in 2002, the country handed control of the United States Senate and Congress to the Republican Party based on their fear-mongering that Saddam Hussein was a grave threat to the United States and possessed weapons of mass destruction. It turned out that those were lies, that he was not a grave threat and didn't possess weapons of mass destruction. Ought we have nullified the 2002 midterm election because it was conducted based on false pretenses? I think the Justice Department was right to drop the charges against Ted Stevens because there was prosecutorial misconduct there, but it doesn't mean that he was not guilty. It just means the prosecutors engaged in misconduct, which compelled the dismissal of those charges.
Time magazine saying that the G20 succeeded President Obama now in France. What is your headline that came out of the meetings yesterday?
I think there's actually a big question mark still over whether or not the G20 nations will be able to reach the kind of consensus that this crisis calls for. They had some cooperation on some broad principles. Whether or not that's actually will manifest into specific cooperative action, I think, very much remains in doubt. We'll see if it's anything more than some diplomatic niceties.
We're getting more Twitters, so you'll have to come back.
I will come back for Twitters anytime.
Glenn Greenwald, thank you very much from Salon.com. Appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
As we've been speaking to you, President Obama in a town hall meeting, we're going to listen. The Washington Journal continues. It is now just about 8 o'clock East Coast time, and in our next hour, a conversation with Glenn Greenwald of Salon.com. And also later in the program, David Brooks, who has a piece this morning in the New York Times called Greed and Stupidity. We'll be digging into some of the details with that. But Glenn Greenwald, thanks very much for joining us.
My pleasure to be here.
Let me begin by something both you and David Brooks write about, and they're the words of another columnist, Simon Johnson. He has a piece in Atlantic Monthly called The Quiet Coup. What is the essence of what he's writing about?
Well, I think it's actually quite frightening, and if I had one article that I could recommend this month that every American would read, it would be Simon Johnson's, because he was previously the chief economist with the International Monetary Fund and has dealt with very severe financial crises in all sorts of countries, similar to the one with which the United States and the rest of the world is currently dealing. And what he says is that the way in which the crisis has unfolded in the United States, and I think more importantly, the way in which we're attempting to address that crisis, is very similar to the way in which other emerging market nations who have experienced grave financial collapse, and he lists Argentina and Russia as the prime examples, attempted to deal with their financial crisis. And in particular, what he says is that what those societies were characterized by, more than anything else, was domination by a very narrow financial elite, essentially the oligarchical class within the country, which was able to influence and control the government to enact policies that were designed to benefit only that narrow class. And because they were so unrestrained in what they were able to do, because their control over their government was so virtually unlimited, they were able to run amok and create essentially financial catastrophe. And then once that catastrophe was created, what the government would then seek to do, because it was so influenced by the wealthiest individuals, is, as a response to the crisis, try and enact even further policies that was designed to prop up and benefit the very oligarchs who caused the crisis in the first place. And what Simon Johnson says is that what's happening in the United States is exactly that our Congress and our government are so controlled, essentially so owned by the financial elites who caused the crisis, that what we're doing is continuing to prop them up at the expense of ordinary Americans.
One point we should mention is that Simon Johnson is going to be with us on Monday for a full hour to take your phone calls from 8 to 9 Eastern Time. But in his piece, he says that essentially the finance industry has effectively captured our government.
Well, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about that. A colleague of his who was previously an economist at the IMF as well, the same day that Simon Johnson started since the Great Depression to prevent another depression, were abolished one by one on a bipartisan basis because they fund both political parties and they were able to write the laws, and those regulations were abolished at their behest. That's what caused the financial crisis, and that same corrupt system is still fueling what is intended to be the solution.
From the G20 to legalizing drugs to Gitmo, you're writing about it all, and we will get into some of the specifics. Do you also Twitter?
Actually, I've started to Twitter, and I think just to experiment with whether it has real value. I haven't actually seen the value in it yet, but I'm still searching with an open mind. I think actually there is a danger that if our communications become too truncated, and Twitter has a 140-character limit on each entry, the amount of our discourse, the level of our discourse can degrade even further still. I mean, we already have political discourse dominated by very short 10-minute or 5-minute segments in between commercial breaks. Assuming the public has a very small attention span, I think Twitter is a step in the wrong direction. And so I do think it has a potential to degrade our discourse even further.
Well, we're going to try it this morning. We'll see how many tweets we get. But if you want to log on to twitter.com/washjournal, and you can, if you have an account, we'll include some of your comments as part of our
article came out, had an op-ed in the Washington Post in which he essentially said that Goldman Sachs, the New York investment bank, seems to have a virtual lock on Treasury Department positions. Under the Clinton administration, the Treasury Secretary was the former Goldman CEO, Robert Rubin. Of course, under President Bush, the CEO who designed the bailout packages was former Goldman Sachs CEO Hank Paulson. The current Treasury Secretary, Tim Geithner, is a protege of Robert Rubin. His chief of staff is a former lobbyist with Goldman Sachs, and that's just one firm. But you look across the government, and what you see is the financial industry, through its enormous financial resources, pouring money into the campaign coffers of the members of Congress, controlling members of the executive branch. And so each and every policy that the executive branch under both Bush and Obama have promulgated and advocated as a response to the crisis has as the prime beneficiaries the financial elites who fund them and who control them, and to whom they are inextricably linked. And it's a form of extreme corruption in general. And I think in a case where there's a real crisis, it's a particular problem. The other thing I would underscore is that if you go back and look at how the crisis began, in the 1990s, the financial industry was advocating rigorously that many of the limitations that existed on what they were able to do that were in place.
A discussion with Glenn Greenwald. You wrote about a question that Chuck Todd, NBC News White House correspondent, asked President Obama at last week's news conference on the issue of sacrifices when it comes to the economy. What were you referring to?
Well, I found Chuck Todd's question unbelievably revealing about how our media stars think. There was a question that arose when George Bush began commencing wars in the wake of 9/11, which was, well, if we're really at war, don't we need to sacrifice as Americans? In other words, how is it that we can go and send our military around the world to invade, destroy, and then attempt to rebuild Iraq and occupy Afghanistan and send billions of dollars to Israel and flood the Middle East with our influence? How can we do all of that, put this enormous pressure, economic pressure, and at the same time give ourselves huge tax cuts? How can we fund this imperialistic foreign policy and at the same time pay less taxes? Eventually the system will collapse, and don't Americans need to sacrifice if we're truly at war? That was the question posed to the Bush administration. So Chuck Todd stood up and asked that same question, though this time to President Obama in a completely different context, in the context of the economic crisis, which he equated to a war. And he said, don't Americans, why aren't you asking Americans to sacrifice? It was a bizarre question, because if you don't live as a millionaire